shall we review the papers? I think so. 6 o'clock in the morning says we should. It's Jack Rowlett, political commentator. Welcome, Jack. How are you doing?
Good morning. Happy New Year. All right, thanks.
Happy New Year. At least we've got something nice to say to each other before the root and branch change of the NHS, which we're going to talk about here. And I introduced that up to 500 deaths, which are totally unavoidable. The consensus over the last hour of the show, Jack, is that our listener and our viewer are right behind a root and branch change. It's now time to deal with the NHS.
Well, it's an utterly staggering statistic, and I know that's reflected across several of the front pages this morning. And as your listeners and viewers are waking up today, they're waking up in a country that can no longer really be said to have universal healthcare.
Wow.
And we pride ourselves on having healthcare that's supposedly free at the point of use. And we look down our nose at America, for example, for having a healthcare system where whether you live or die is determined by your wage or your job. And yet in this country, we now have a healthcare system that's equally bad, arguably. It's just whether you get the care you need is determined seemingly at random in a healthcare system that is crumbling all around us. And that 500 deaths a week statistic is one of the most morbid, but there's lots of other sort of aspects of this crisis as well. We know that operations are being delayed. We know that sort of elderly people are having to wait 4 days for a bed. In some cases, it feels like the whole system is broken. And as has been reflected in your program over the last hour or so, it does feel like the public may finally be waking up to the idea that we need to take a different approach to the NHS.
And in your opinion, Jack, as a newspaper reviewer, how can you reapportion £130 billion a year? What's the best way? Getting rid of the middle management, more nurses on the wards, more training for doctors? I don't know. Where is the overall cure?
Well, it feels like there's lots of ideas sort of floating around at the moment. I don't think there's one sort of silver bullet solution. And I think the middle management sort of bogeyman is often sort of said, but actually it's much more complex than that. So one thing we could do is we could look at sort of reducing the burden on the NHS through pharmacies by allowing them to prescribe medication. I think that would be a really good idea.
Yeah.
We also need to sort out social care, because that is a big underlying cause of the reason why the NHS is in such a state. We see at the moment that there are all these people in beds and they're fit to be discharged, but there's nowhere for them to go because the social care system is totally broken. So they're taking up NHS capacity. There's also the fact that we've underinvested in sort of capital investment in the NHS, so on buildings and equipment. And we also know that over the past sort of decade or so, even longer, the NHS hasn't really taken a preventative approach to care. There's so much focus on acute care, as in dealing with people when it's too late, as in they really need accident and emergency care now. And there's not enough focus on preventing them from becoming ill or unhealthy in the first place. So I think that's where the solution really lies here.
And now this is, it's a funny headline, but it's a very serious story, which is from The Guardian. The consequence of not being seen by your local hospital or doctor is that people are turning to what they're calling DIY health treatment amid the shortage of GP appointments. What does that mean? Googling, oh yeah, that'll fix it. Get a spanner in there and sort it out. Or are people just sort of going in and sort of misdiagnosing themselves because they've got a headache and they think they, God forbid, have a brain tumour and do terrible things to themselves? What's going on?
Well, I think in a lot of cases, Jonny, it's exactly that. And that's what the Guardian story is sort of describing there. We're seeing people who just can't get a GP appointment. And so they're doing a bit of research online. They're thinking, okay, that's the medicine I need. And they're ordering that medicine from a pharmacy or online. And then they're not ending up with adequate treatment. And of course, if you misdiagnose your own problem and it's actually something serious, then you may well need NHS care later on anyway. And actually, by delaying having that access to care, you're going to become more ill, and that's going to become more of a burden on the NHS. So it's a cycle of despair, really. And in that same story as well, we know that also people are having to rely on private care more and more. I think it's 11% of people now in this country have had to go private for a health condition because they simply cannot get that care on the NHS, either at all or within a satisfactory time frame. And it's disgraceful.
It is something that I think is in need of change. Now, I'm going to put the two Rishi Sunak stories together here. First of all, The Times says the Prime Minister could push for votes on anti-strike laws within days, and this is to stave off what is largely coalescing into what looks like a bit of a general strike situation, where all the public sector bodies and some of them in private sector are pushing for double-digit inflationary rises in their wages and better conditions. And the story from The Sun is that there's a battle cry from the Prime Minister who vows to start a fight back as the Tories trail Labour in the polls. I'm putting these stories together, Jack, because if the Tories are ever going to have to tighten that lead that Labour have over them in the polls, they're going to have to be tough and demonstrate what Boris Johnson seemed to do against Jeremy Corbyn in the run-up to 2019 general election, and be tough and talk to the red wall.
No, exactly. And I think, quite frankly, it's staggering that we haven't had this strike legislation yet, that it's taken this long. And even that Times story says that there's the possibility that it might wait until further into the year. It might not be in the very near future. But that legislation would, for example, put limits on the number of staff. So it would say that a certain number of staff had to be available at all times during strike conditions. So it would set mandatory limits. And it's also being suggested that they might ban certain strikes altogether, which I think would be a very good idea. You know, the police aren't allowed to strike, the army aren't allowed to strike. I don't see why other parts of the emergency services should be able to strike, because they're just as vital. And that story in The Sun, of course, is sort of one of delusion, really, because Rishi Sunak appears to not believe the current polling, and he seems to think that the conditions for the Tories are much better than they actually are. And he talks about how actually it sort of seems that he thinks that with a couple of tweaks, they can turn it around and they can win again. And actually, the situation is really, really dire for them.
Do you think, Jack, it's all over for the Tories? Are we nursing the final year and a half of the Conservative administration before Sir Keir Starmer comes in and sorts it out?
Yeah, I think we absolutely are. I mean, you only have to look at their approval ratings on sort of every aspect of policy, whether it's healthcare or education, the economy, foreign policy. Their numbers are looking so bad. And you sort of pointed out the 2019 general election with Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn. But actually, the case of rescuing the Tories then was a relatively simple one, in terms of Boris Johnson could come in and say, OK, I'm going to get Brexit done. And that sort of unlocked the deadlock. Now we have sort of red lights flashing on the dashboard across all areas of policy. And it sort of feels like even if Rishi Sunak comes up with a good plan to solve the NHS backlog and to sort out education and to get the economy back on the right track, things are still not going to be in a good way by the time of the next general election. And so it feels like even if things are going in the right direction, people are still going to turn to Labour simply because the country's not going to be in a good way.
Jack, there is a reminiscence about the 1997 general election where John Major and Black Wednesday really killed off the credibility of his government. Norman Lamont, who knew less about it than the city traders, and he came out brushing his hair straight. Oh, it's been a terrible day, honestly, and I've made George Soros very rich. And Tony Blair was very charismatic and young and fresh, and things could only get better and all that stuff. And he then won this huge majority over John Major, got absolutely annihilated the Tories, and they were out of power until 2010. The difference here is that Sir Keir Starmer doesn't have that young go-ahead charisma. And it seems that if he does win, it'll be by default over a calamitous and hapless 2022 for the Tories. In other words, the Tories will lose this one as opposed to Labour winning it.
Yeah, I think that's probably correct. But I would also say that that's usually the case in general elections. There's the odd adage that oppositions don't win elections, governments lose them. And I think 1997 really is the exception. Yeah. That's one of the very few elections where a really charismatic opposition leader has been able to actually win in circumstances that was sort of favourable to the Conservatives. We often forget how strong the economy was in 1997 in the run-up to that general election. And that's why I think this upcoming election will be even worse potentially, because they don't even have a strong economy to fall back on now. Things are just really bad across the board.
Jack, another story about which has been coming out for days, and that is that almost 46,000 migrants crossed the Channel in 2022. That's up from about 28,000 the year before. Again, Sunak and Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, are trying to talk tough and said we're going to bring in legislation which is going to try and repatriate migrants to wherever they came from, or Rwanda, or, you know, not here. Hotels are being filled in very nice areas of the country, not in my backyard, from some people who live across the road from the Holiday Inn Express or wherever it might be. Other hotels are available. But the question is, I suppose the metric is, will we have less than 46,000 migrants come into the country next year? It's vital for Sunak, isn't it?
It is. And he seems to think it's a really big priority, and it certainly is, according to the remaining Tory voters. But I think the even more shocking statistic in that article is actually that the number has risen. It's 150 times higher in 2022 than it was just in 2018.
Yes.
So that's even more staggering. But I think what's really obvious is that whatever your view on this, the Tories have failed you over the past 13 years. If you're pro-immigration, if you want to let more people in for the economic benefits, then you're definitely not getting that from the Conservatives because of the hostile environment and the sort of general anti-immigrant attitude we've seen. But if you want to reduce numbers, then you're also not getting what you want, because for all the tough talk, the Tories haven't got numbers down. We've seen with this article, they're just swelling, they're increasing year on year. And of course, we've got this Rwanda plan, but there's no real evidence that Rwanda has anything like the capacity required to take all these asylum seekers that are coming across the Channel. They don't have anywhere near enough capacity for that. So it's sort of another example of tough talking, but it's not really actually a solution. And at the same time, we have all these job vacancies. We have inflation running at a half-century high, but we're not letting people in to come and fill these jobs. It's just ridiculous. There's a sort of dissonance between what the economy requires and the way the government is talking about immigration.
It's an extraordinary year of change, which, judging by all the experts and you on the phone in the last hour or so, has definitely seen so many consequences of what we're going to see, which are still unfolding. And talking of Extinction Rebellion, who have been tying themselves to the floor and stopping the traffic everywhere and building pink boats in Oxford Circus in recent years, apparently they've realised that their disruption is extremely unpopular, and they're now going to halt their disruptive protests and go for another form of protests. What's that going to look like, Jack?
Well, they sort of they have this idea that they're going to get 100,000 people together and sort of protest outside Parliament and cause massive amounts of disruption for politicians rather than people who are trying to get to work and school and sort of go about their day. I think this is a positive thing. This can provide us with a sort of modest amount of cheer on this dark January morning.
Go on, tell us.
Eco-Marxists are going to stop disrupting our lives to this extent. But we do have to take this with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because they are clear here that it's only a temporary halt. And there's also a quote in that Daily Mail article from the Just Stop Oil eco-Marxists saying that they're very much going to be continuing with the sorts of protests that have made the headlines over the past few months. So we can't say it's over yet, really, but it is a step in the right direction. I think it's any sort of reduction in that type of protest is good, both for people who want good climate policy and don't want climate policy to be associated with people who are causing unnecessary disruption, and also for people who just want to get to work and feed their families and go about their day without being stopped by a bunch of middle-class losers who don't recognise the need to go to work and have an ordinary life.
Other classes of losers are available. Jack Rowlett, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Talk TV. Another quarter hour